Hello and welcome to our journey through time. Today, we're going to set off on a voyage, not just across the vast blue oceans of our world, but through the deep history of life itself. We're going to follow the footsteps of a man who was often clumsy, frequently seasick, and constantly curious. His name was Charles Darwin. Before he became the silver-bearded face of science, he was just a boy who loved collecting beetles and wondering why the world worked the way it did. Through his eyes, we'll see how a single idea grew from a tiny seed into a tree of life that connects every living thing on Earth. It's a story of adventure, giant tortoises, secret notebooks, and the courage to see the world differently. Before we begin our first chapter, if you enjoy these stories and find them a relaxing way to learn, please consider liking and subscribing to the podcast. It truly costs nothing, but it helps us more than you know to keep these histories coming to you. And for those who feel like going an extra mile to support our work, a small donation at ko-fi.com/history to relax means the world to us and helps keep this channel independent and growing. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's settle in, take a deep breath, and travel back to a quiet house in England, where our story begins. Part 1. The Boy Who Loved Beetles. Imagine, if you will, a very large, comfortable red brick house sitting on a hill overlooking the Severn River in a town called Shrewsbury, England. The year is 1809. It's a time of horse-drawn carriages, flickering candlelight, and big, heavy books. Inside this house, which was known as the Mount, a little boy named Charles Robert Darwin was born. From the very beginning, the world around him was filled with wonder, though it wasn't always the kind of wonder his teachers would have appreciated. Charlie, as his family called him, was a quiet boy with a round face and a mind that never seemed to stop moving. His father, Dr. Robert Darwin, was a man of great presence. He was a massive man, so large in fact, that he had to have special floors built in his house and a special carriage to carry his weight. He was a very successful doctor, a man who knew everyone and had an opinion on everything. He was kind, but he was also very, very serious. He wanted his children to be successful, to be respected, and to follow the rules of society. But little Charlie had a different set of rules. While his father was out visiting patients, Charlie was in the garden. He didn't see just a lawn and some flower beds. He saw a kingdom. He spent his days looking at the ground, watching how ants carried crumbs, or how the dew stayed on a leaf long after the sun came up. He began a habit that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He started collecting things. Not just one or two things, mind you, but everything. He collected minerals, shells, coins, and even postal seals. If it was small, interesting, and could fit in a pocket, Charlie wanted it. His mother, Susanna, was a gentlewoman from the famous Wedgwood family, the people who made the beautiful blue and white pottery you might still see in museums today. Sadly, when Charlie was only 8 years old, his mother passed away. It was a heavy blow to the household. Charlie didn't talk about it much later in life. Perhaps the memory was too painful, or perhaps he was simply too young to fully understand the hole she left behind. His older sisters took over the job of raising him, and they were very strict. They wanted him to be a perfect gentleman, but Charlie was much more interested in being a naturalist. When it came time for school, Charlie was sent to a nearby boarding school run by a man named Dr. Butler. Now, in the early 1800s, school wasn't about science or creativity. It was about Latin and Greek. It was about memorizing long poems and ancient grammar. For Charlie, this was like being trapped in a cage. He hated it. He would sit at his wooden desk, staring out the window at the birds flying past. wishing he could be out there with them. He was a slow student, or so his teachers thought. In reality, he wasn't slow at all. He was just bored. His mind was built for the real world, not the world of dead languages. Because he struggled with his schoolwork, his father started to get worried. One day, Dr. Robert Darwin sat his son down and said something that must have stung like a wasp. He told him, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Can you imagine being a young boy and hearing your father, the man you look up to most, say that you might be a disgrace? It hurt Charlie, but it didn't change who he was. He couldn't help it. He loved the outdoors. He loved the rat catching and the dogs because they were part of the living world. There is a wonderful, funny story from these years that shows just how obsessed he was with his collections. By the time he was a teenager, he had moved on from minerals and shells to something much more exciting: beetles. At the time, collecting beetles was a very popular hobby in England, almost like collecting trading cards today. One day, Charlie was out in the woods and saw two rare beetles. He quickly grabbed one in his left hand and one in his right. He was so proud. But then, a moment later, he spotted a third beetle, a species he had never seen before. What was he to do? He didn't have a third hand, and he didn't want to let go of the two he already had. In a moment of pure, messy genius, he took the beetle in his right hand and popped it into his mouth. He figured he could hold it there behind his teeth for just a second while he grabbed the new one. But the beetle in his mouth was not happy about this plan. To defend itself, the tiny insect sprayed a very hot, very bitter, and very painful liquid right onto Charlie's tongue. He yelled in pain, spat the beetle out, and in the confusion, he dropped the other two beetles as well. He went home that day with an empty hand and a burnt tongue, but with a story he would tell for years. As Charlie got a little older, he found a new interest that his father actually approved of: chemistry. His older brother, Erasmus, named after their famous grandfather, had built a small chemistry laboratory in the garden tool shed. The two brothers would spend hours in that smelly, smoky little shack, mixing liquids and making things change color or fizz. It was Charlie's first real taste of doing science. He loved the precision of it, the way you could test an idea and see if it was true. But his school didn't like it. His headmaster even called him a poco curante, which is a fancy way of saying someone who doesn't care about important things, because he spent too much time on useless chemistry experiments. Eventually, his father decided that enough was enough. Since Charlie was clearly not going to be a scholar of Latin, and since he loved his chemistry and his biology, there was only one path left for a gentleman of his status. He should become a doctor. His father and his grandfather had been famous doctors, so it made sense. In 1825, at the age of 16, Charlie was packed up and sent away from the beautiful gardens of Shrewsbury to the cold, grey and rainy streets of Edinburgh, Scotland. He was going to the best medical school in the world. His father was hopeful. He thought that maybe, just maybe, seeing the reality of medicine would turn his rat-catching son into a man of science. But Edinburgh was a dark place for a boy as sensitive as Charlie. In those days, there was no anesthesia. There were no medicines to put people to sleep before surgery. If you needed an operation, you had to be awake for it. Charlie attended 2 surgeries, and they were the most horrific things he had ever seen. He couldn't stand the blood. He couldn't stand the screaming of the patients. He walked out of the operating theatre, trembling, and never went back. He knew right then and there, he could never, ever be a doctor. He didn't tell his father right away. He was too scared. But he stopped going to his medical classes. Instead, he found a new home in the Edinburgh Museum. He met a man named John Edmonston, a formerly enslaved man from Guyana who had come to Scotland. John was a master at taxidermy, the art of preserving animals so they look like they are still alive. Charlie spent hours with John, learning how to carefully skin a bird and stuff it so it looked perfect. It was a skill that would prove to be one of the most important things he ever learned. While his classmates were learning about human anatomy, Charlie was learning how to preserve the beauty of nature. He also joined a group called the Plinian Society, where young people talked about natural history. He met people who believed that maybe, just maybe, the world was much older than the Bible said it was. He started to hear whispers of ideas that suggested animals might change over time. These were dangerous ideas back then, ideas that could get you in trouble. But to Charlie, they were like magnets. They pulled at his curiosity. He was a young man now, standing at a crossroads. He had failed at Latin, he had failed at medicine, and he was hiding a big secret from his father. He was a drifter, a wanderer, a boy who just wanted to look at birds and beetles. He didn't know it yet, but the grey skies of Edinburgh were about to clear, and a letter was coming. A letter that would offer him a chance to step onto a ship and sail right into the history books. But before he could sail, he had to face his father one more time. He had to figure out what a disgrace like him was supposed to do with his life. And as we will see in our next chapter, the answer was something that neither he nor his father could have ever imagined. For now, let's leave young Charlie there, walking the windswept docks of Scotland, with the smell of the sea in his nose, and a heart full of questions that the world wasn't yet ready to answer. So, there stood young Charles, standing on the docks of Edinburgh, with the cold sea breeze whipping at his coat, and a very heavy secret weighing down his heart. He had just walked away from the most prestigious medical school in the world. He had seen the blood. He had heard the screams of the surgery room, and he knew, with every fibre of his being, that he could never be a doctor. But now came the hard part. He had to go home and tell his father, the giant, imposing Dr. Robert Darwin, that the family's investment had been a total waste. As we move into this next chapter of our story, I want you to imagine the tension in that carriage ride back to Shrewsbury. Charles was a young man who hated conflict. He wanted to please people, especially his father. But how do you tell a man who thinks you're a disgrace that you've just quit the only respectable career path left for you? When Charles finally sat down with his father at the family home, the air was thick. Dr. Robert wasn't just angry, he was worried. In those days, if you were a wealthy young gentleman and you weren't going to be a doctor or a lawyer, there was really only one safe place for you: the church. The plan was simple, if a bit cynical. Charles would go to Cambridge University, study divinity, and become a country parson. Now, being a country parson in the 1820s wasn't exactly a high-pressure job. It mostly involved living in a nice, quiet house in the countryside, giving a short sermon on Sundays, and spending the rest of the week, well, doing whatever you wanted. For Charles, this sounded like a dream. Not because he was particularly religious. He was a quiet believer at the time. But because a country parson had plenty of time to go for walks, look at birds, and of course, collect his beloved beetles. So, in early 1828, Charles Darwin arrived at Christ's College, Cambridge. And if Edinburgh was a dark, bloody nightmare for him, Cambridge was a bright, golden dream. But here's the funny thing. He still wasn't a very good student. He found the lectures on theology and math almost as boring as the Latin he had hated as a boy. Instead of studying his Bible, Charles became a bit of a social butterfly. He joined a group of wealthy students who called themselves the Gourmet Club. They would sit around eating exotic meats that weren't usually on the menu, like hawk and bittern. He spent a lot of money on fine clothes, went horseback riding across the countryside, and spent his nights drinking wine and playing cards with his friends. To anyone looking on, Charles Darwin looked like just another rich, lazy kid wasting his father's money. But beneath that surface of dinner parties and horse racing, the old Beetle boy was still there. And at Cambridge, his obsession turned into a full-blown fever. At that time, Cambridge was the center of what people called Beatlemania. It sounds silly to us now, but for these young men, finding a rare beetle was like finding a rare diamond. Charles was the most competitive of them all. He even hired a local man to go out and scrape the moss off old trees or pull up weeds from the river, just so Charles could look through the debris for hidden insects. He would spend his mornings in the fields, his pockets bulging with little glass jars. He once wrote that the feeling of finding a new species gave him a rush of blood to the head. It was his true passion. He wasn't just collecting, he was starting to notice things. He noticed how certain beetles lived only in certain woods. He noticed how their colors helped them hide. He was training his eyes to see the tiny details that everyone else walked right past. It was during this time that Charles met the man who would truly change his life. His name was John Stevens Henslow. Henslow was a professor of botany, but more than that, he was a kind, brilliant, and patient mentor. He held open houses every Friday night, where students could come and talk about plants, animals, and the mysteries of the natural world. Charles started going every week. Henslow saw something in Charles that no one else had seen, not his father, and certainly not his old schoolmasters. He saw a man with a rare gift for observation. He saw a man who didn't just look, but saw. Soon, the two became so close that people at Cambridge started calling Charles the man who walks with Henslow. They would spend hours walking through the university gardens, talking about how flowers were built, or how different species were distributed across the land. Under Henslow's wing, Charles started to take his interests seriously. He realized that science wasn't just a hobby. It was a way of understanding the mind of the Creator, or so he thought at the time. He began to study geology, the study of rocks, and the history of the Earth. Henslow introduced him to another professor, a tough-as-nails geologist named Adam Sedgwick. In the summer of 1831, Sedgwick took Charles on a trip to North Wales to study the ancient rock layers. This was boot camp for a naturalist. They hiked miles every day, cracking open rocks with hammers and trying to read the story of the Earth written in the stone. Charles learned that the Earth was incredibly old, much older than most people believed. He saw how mountains were formed and how valleys were carved. He was learning the language of the planet. As that summer trip came to an end, Charles headed back home to Shrewsbury. He was 22 years old. He had his degree from Cambridge, and the plan was still for him to become a country priest. He was ready to settle down, get a quiet little church, and spend his life as a hobbyist, collecting bugs in his spare time. He thought his life was already mapped out. He thought he knew exactly what the next 40 years would look like. But when he walked through the door of his house, there was a letter waiting for him on the table. It was a thick envelope, sealed with wax, and it had been sent by his mentor, Professor Henslow. Charles sat down, broke the seal, and started to read. His heart began to race. The British Admiralty was planning a voyage to map the coast of South America. They were looking for a gentleman naturalist, someone who could travel on the ship, keep the captain company, and collect samples of the plants and animals they found along the way. The ship was a small 10-gun brig called the HMS Beagle. The letter said that Henslow had been offered the job first, but he couldn't go. He had told the captain, "I know just the man for you. His name is Charles Darwin." Can you imagine the shock? 1 minute, Charles is thinking about which hymns he'll play in a quiet English village, and the next, he's being invited to sail around the world. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was the adventure he had dreamed about while staring out the school windows as a boy. But there was a problem. A very big, very grumpy problem. His father, Dr. Robert Darwin, was not impressed. To him, this looked like yet another way for his son to drift. He had already quit medicine. He had already spent a fortune at Cambridge. And now, instead of starting his real job in the church, he wanted to go on a wild goose chase on a tiny, cramped boat for 2 years? Dr. Robert said no. And in the Darwin house, when the doctor said no, that was usually the end of the story. Charles was devastated. He wrote back to Henslow, politely declining the offer, his heart breaking with every word. He felt like the door to his future had just slammed shut. But Charles had one more person in his corner, his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood. Uncle Jos was a man his father respected. When Jos heard about the trip, he saw it differently. He saw it as a way for Charles to grow up, to become a man of character. Uncle Jos drove Charles all the way back to the Darwin house and sat down with the doctor. They talked for hours. Jos argued that this wasn't a drift. It was a rare honor. He told the doctor that Charles had a special talent and that it would be a shame to waste it. Slowly, the big doctor's resolve started to melt. He looked at his son, the boy who loved beetles, the boy who couldn't stand blood, and he finally sighed. "If you can find one man of common sense who advises you to go," the father said, "then I will give my consent." Uncle Jos was that man of common sense. The permission was granted. Charles was over the moon. He immediately started packing. He bought telescopes, magnifying glasses, jars of chemicals for preserving specimens, and a mountain of warm clothes. He was no longer the disgrace of the family. He was a chosen explorer. But as he traveled down to the docks of Plymouth to see the ship for the first time, a new feeling started to creep in. Doubt. He looked at the HMS Beagle, and his heart sank. The ship was tiny. It was only 90 feet long, about the size of 2 large buses. It was going to be home to over 70 men. It was crowded. It was smelling of tar and old wood. And it was going to be his world for a very, very long time. He also met the captain, Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy was a young, intense man with a fiery temper and a very scientific face. In fact, Fitzroy almost rejected Charles because he thought the shape of Charles's nose indicated that he didn't have enough energy for the trip. Luckily, the captain changed his mind. As the December winds began to howl, Charles Darwin sat in his tiny cabin, surrounded by his crates and his books. He was about to leave everything he knew, his family, his comfortable house, his quiet future, and sail into the unknown. He was terrified. He was excited. And within just a few hours of leaving the harbor, he would discover something about himself that he hadn't planned for. He was a terrible sailor, but the anchor was coming up. The sails were unfurling. The Beagle was turning its nose toward the open sea. And as the coast of England faded into a thin grey line on the horizon, the boy who loved beetles was about to become the man who would change the world. He didn't know that the 2-year trip would actually last 5. He didn't know that he would see mountains crumble and islands rise. He only knew that the wind was in the sails, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. So, there he was. Charles Darwin, the young man who had spent his life in quiet English gardens and dusty university halls, was finally standing on the deck of the HMS Beagle. The date was December 27th, 1831. As the heavy iron anchor was hauled up from the mud of Plymouth Harbor and the great white sails unfurled like the wings of a giant bird, Charles felt a mixture of pure, electrifying excitement and a deep, sinking dread. He was leaving behind his father, his sisters, his comfortable bed, and the only world he had ever known. In this third part of our story, we are going to join Charles as he discovers that the life of an explorer is not quite as glamorous as the books make it out to be. It is a story of a very upset stomach, a very small room, and the moment a young man's mind truly began to expand beyond the horizon. As the Beagle moved away from the coast, the gentle rolling of the harbor turned into the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the Atlantic Ocean. And almost immediately, our hero ran into a problem. Charles Darwin, the man who would explain the survival of the fittest, was not at all fit for the sea. He became terribly, horribly, and quite hilariously seasick. For the first few weeks, Charles spent most of his time hanging over the side of the ship or curled up in his hammock, wishing that the world would just stop moving. Now you have to remember how small this ship was. Imagine a space about the size of a modern city bus, and then imagine living there with 70 other men for years. Charles shared a tiny cabin at the very back of the ship with 2 other officers. It was so cramped that he had to remove a drawer from a cabinet just to make room for his feet when he slept in his hammock. Above his head, just a few inches away, was the wooden deck where sailors would stomp and shout all night long. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, salt, tar, and the questionable cooking of the ship's galley. But even through the nausea and the cramped quarters, Charles had a secret weapon, a library. He had brought a collection of books with him, and one in particular would change everything. It was the first volume of a book called Principles of Geology by a man named Charles Lyell. His mentor, Professor Henslow, had given it to him with a warning: read it, but do not believe everything it says. Lyell's book argued something radical. It said that the Earth wasn't just a few thousand years old, and it wasn't shaped by sudden, giant catastrophes like Noah's flood. Instead, Lyell argued that the Earth was millions of years old and was shaped by tiny, slow changes, like a river slowly carving a canyon or a volcano slowly building an island over vast amounts of time. As Charles lay in his swaying hammock, reading by the light of a flickering candle, his mind began to race. If the Earth changed slowly over millions of years, what did that mean for the animals living on it? After 3 weeks of misery at sea, the Beagle finally reached its first stop, the Cape Verde Islands, off the coast of Africa. For Charles, stepping onto dry land felt like being born again. The ground didn't wobble. The air didn't smell like old fish. He grabbed his notebook, his geological hammer, and his magnifying glass, and ran into the volcanic landscape of an island called St. Diego. It was here, in the hot, dusty silence of the island, that Charles had his first eureka moment. As he was walking along the coast, he looked up at the high volcanic cliffs and saw something strange. Halfway up the cliffside, there was a perfectly straight, horizontal white stripe. He climbed up to investigate and found that this stripe was made entirely of crushed seashells and coral. He sat there, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and thought, these shells belonged in the ocean. So, how did they get 30 feet above the sea? If Charles Lyell was right, the ocean hadn't dropped. The land had risen. He imagined the earth pushing upward, inch by inch, over thousands of years, lifting the seafloor into the sky. It was his first real proof that the world was not a static, unchanging stage. It was a living, breathing, moving thing. This discovery gave Charles a new kind of energy. He wasn't just a gentleman companion for the captain anymore. He was a detective, looking for clues about the history of the world. He started collecting everything he could find on the island. Strange dust that fell from the sky, which he later found out was tiny organisms blown all the way from Africa. Colorful tropical birds and odd-looking plants. He was learning how to be a scientist in the field, not just in a classroom. As the Beagle set sail again, heading southwest across the Atlantic towards South America, the mood on the ship changed. They were approaching the equator. Now, in the tradition of the British Navy, crossing the equator, or crossing the line, was a very big deal. It involved a rowdy, funny, and somewhat messy ceremony, where the sailors who had never crossed before had to face King Neptune. Charles, being a landlubber, had to participate. He was blindfolded, doused with buckets of cold seawater, and shaved with a giant wooden razor covered in smelly grease and tar. He took it all with a good sense of humor, though I imagine he was quite happy when it was over and he could go back to his books. It was a moment of bonding with the crew. They started to realize that this young beetle-collecting gentleman wasn't just a snob. He was one of them. Day after day, the sun grew hotter and the sea turned a deeper shade of blue. Charles spent his time on deck, leaning over the railing, watching the plankton glow in the ship's wake at night. He wondered how many thousands of tiny lives were in just one bucket of water. He was starting to see that life was everywhere, in every corner of the ocean, in shapes and colors he had never even imagined in his wildest dreams. Then one morning in late February 1832, a cry came from the mast. "Land ho!" The Beagle had reached the coast of Brazil. As they sailed into the harbor of Salvador Bahia, Charles stood at the front of the ship, frozen in awe. He had read about tropical forests. He had seen drawings of palm trees, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of South America. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth, sweet flowers, and ripening fruit. The noise was incredible, a wall of sound made by thousands of insects, birds, and monkeys, all screaming and buzzing at once. The colors were so bright they almost hurt his eyes. Every shade of green imaginable was tangled together, with flashes of brilliant red and blue from the wings of macaws and butterflies the size of dinner plates. For a boy who had grown up in the orderly, quiet gardens of England, this was like stepping onto another planet. He wrote in his diary that he felt like a blind man who had suddenly been given sight. He spent his first few days in the Brazilian jungle in a state of chaotic delight. He would stop to look at a flower, then see a strange ant, then hear a bird, and not know where to turn his head first. "A mind is a chaos of delight," he wrote. It was the perfect description. But Brazil wasn't just a paradise of nature. It was also here that Charles encountered something that deeply upset him. Captain Fitzroy, the man he shared his meals with, was a supporter of slavery. Charles, who came from a family of fierce abolitionists, could not stand the sight of people being treated like property. One day, the two men had a terrible argument. Fitzroy claimed that slaves were happy, and Charles, with fire in his eyes, asked how the captain could possibly know that without asking them. The argument was so heated that the captain almost kicked Charles off the ship right then and there. They eventually made peace, but it was a reminder to Charles that the world was not just a place of beautiful birds and ancient rocks. It was also a place of human struggle and complicated morals. This tension stayed with him as the Beagle continued its journey south. He was learning that to understand life, you have to look at the whole picture, the beauty and the pain, the tiny shells in the cliff and the vast forests of the coast. He was no longer the boy who popped beetles into his mouth for fun. He was becoming a man who looked at the world with a deep, serious questioning. He was collecting data, filling his notebooks, and shipping crates of specimens back to England. He was starting to notice that the plants and animals of South America were different from the ones in Europe, even if they lived in similar climates. Why was that? Why didn't God just put the same animals in the same places? As the sun set over the Brazilian coast, turning the sky into a palette of purple and gold, Charles Darwin sat on the deck, listening to the water lap against the hull. He was thousands of miles from home. His stomach was finally feeling better, and the greatest adventure of his life was just beginning. He had no idea that the fossils he was about to find in the mud of the next stop would provide the first real spark for an idea that would eventually set the world on fire. For now, he was content to just breathe in the heavy, sweet air of the tropics and listen to the jungle breathe back at him. The Beagle was moving on, deeper into the southern hemisphere, toward the wild, windswept plains of Patagonia. And that is where our next chapter begins. The lush, emerald green of the Brazilian jungle was now a beautiful memory, fading in the ship's wake. As the HMS Beagle continued its journey south, the world began to change again. The air grew thinner and colder, and the vibrant, noisy forests were replaced by vast, silent, and windswept plains. We are entering the fourth part of our story, a chapter where Charles Darwin stops looking at the colorful surface of the world and starts digging deep into its basement. This is the story of the bones in the mud and the ghosts of giants. By late 1832, the Beagle arrived at the coast of Patagonia, in what we now call Argentina. If Brazil was a chaos of delight, Patagonia was a mystery of stone and dust. The landscape was dominated by the pampas, huge flat grasslands that seemed to go on forever under a giant, pale blue sky. For the sailors, it was a lonely place. But for Charles, it was a playground. He spent weeks on land, riding horses with the gauchos, the rugged South American cowboys who lived on the plains. Charles loved it. He learned how to use a bola, a rope with weights used to catch animals. He ate roasted meat over open fires, and he slept under the stars. He was becoming less like a polite English gentleman and more like a true frontiersman. One afternoon, near a place called Punta Alta, Charles was walking along a low cliff by the sea. The waves had been hitting the cliff for centuries, slowly eating away at the red mud and clay. As Charles looked at the face of the cliff, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Poking out of the dirt was a piece of white bone. But it wasn't just any bone. It was massive. Charles grabbed his hammer and his trowel and began to dig. He dug for hours, the salt spray of the ocean hitting his back, and the dry dust of Patagonia filling his lungs. As he cleared away the mud, a giant skull began to emerge. It was enormous, bigger than the skull of an ox. Beside it, he found huge, heavy teeth and pieces of what looked like a suit of armor made of bone. Now imagine Charles sitting there on the beach, wiping the sweat and dirt from his forehead, looking at these remains. He knew his biology. He knew what animals lived in the world today. But he had never seen anything like this. These weren't the bones of a cow or a horse. These were the remains of creatures that seemed to belong to a fairy tale. He had found the fossils of what we now call the Megatherium, a giant ground sloth the size of an elephant, and the Glyptodon, a creature that looked like a massive armadillo, as big as a small car, covered in a heavy, stony shell. This was a turning point for Charles. He sat there in the dirt, his mind spinning with questions. He realized that these giants were long gone. They were extinct. But here was the mystery. The giant sloth he found looked very, very similar to the tiny living sloths he had seen hanging from the trees in the Brazilian jungle. The giant, armored Glyptodon looked almost exactly like the small armadillos that scurried across the Patagonian plains today. A question began to whisper in the back of his mind. Why? Why would God create a giant version of an animal, let it die out, and then create a tiny version that looked almost exactly like it? Was it possible that they weren't two different creations? Was it possible that somehow, over a very long time, the giant had changed into the smaller version to survive in a changing world? In the 1830s, this was a very dangerous thought. Most people believed that every animal was created perfectly and stayed exactly the same forever. But the bones in the mud were telling Charles a different story. They were telling him that life has a history, a long, complicated history where some things vanish and others adapt. Charles became obsessed with his bone hunting. He filled crates with these fossils, carefully wrapping them in paper and packing them with dried grass to ship back to England. He knew that the scientists back home would be amazed, but he also knew that he was the only one who had seen where they lived. He was the one seeing the connection between the dead and the living. But it wasn't just the dead giants that caught his eye. While riding across the plains, Charles noticed a large, flightless bird called a rhea. It looks a bit like an ostrich. He noticed that in one part of the plains, there was one type of rhea, but as he traveled further south, a different, slightly smaller and browner version of the bird appeared. He asked himself, why would there be two different kinds of the same bird in two different areas? If the environment was mostly the same, why did the bird change just because it moved a few hundred miles? It was another piece of the puzzle. It suggested that animals were linked to the specific land they lived on. As the sun began to set over the Patagonian horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of deep orange and purple, Charles would sit by the campfire with the gauchos. He listened to their stories, but his mind was back at the cliffs. He was beginning to see the world as a giant, moving picture. He saw the earth rising, like he saw in Cape Verde. He saw the animals of the past, the giant sloths, and he saw the animals of the present, the small armadillos. He was starting to connect the dots. However, life on the Beagle wasn't just about bones and birds. It was still a ship of war, and the journey was getting more dangerous. Captain Fitzroy was becoming more stressed as they approached the bottom of the world. The weather was turning violent. The winds of the South Atlantic were famous for being able to flip a ship over in seconds. The crew was tired. The food was getting old, and the constant dampness was starting to make everyone irritable. Charles, despite his growing confidence as a scientist, was still the young gentleman who got seasick. He spent many nights in his hammock, listening to the wood of the ship groan under the pressure of the waves, clutching his journals. He missed his sisters. He missed the green hills of England. But whenever he looked at the massive, ancient teeth he had found in the dirt, he felt a spark of lightning in his soul. He knew he was onto something. He was no longer just collecting curiosities. He was collecting evidence. He was beginning to realize that the world was much older, much more violent, and much more creative than any book had ever taught him. The disgrace of the Darwin family was now the man who was rediscovering the lost giants of the earth. The Beagle weighed anchor and began to move even further south, toward the jagged, icy rocks of Tierra del Fuego. This would be the most difficult part of the trip. The sun would barely rise, the snow would fall horizontally, and Charles would face the most challenging questions about human nature he had ever encountered. But as the ship tilted into the cold southern spray, Charles Darwin wasn't looking back. He was looking forward, his pockets full of fossil teeth and his mind full of a theory that was just beginning to breathe. He was learning that the world doesn't just exist, it happens. and he was determined to figure out how. So, let's leave our friend Charles for tonight, huddled in his coat on the deck, watching the giant bones of the past fade into the mist as the Beagle sails toward the edge of the world. The giants are dead, but the ideas they gave him are very, very much alive. As the HMS Beagle turned its nose toward the very bottom of the world, the warm golden memories of Brazil and the dusty plains of Patagonia felt like they belonged to a different life. The sky turned a heavy, bruising shade of grey, and the wind began to howl with a voice that sounded almost human. We have reached the 5th part of our story, a chapter where Charles Darwin faces the raw, frozen edges of the earth. This is the story of Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, where the mountains wear ice like a coat, and where Charles would ask his deepest questions yet about what it truly means to be human. Now, you might be wondering why it was called the land of fire if it was so cold. Well, when the first European explorers sailed past these islands hundreds of years ago, they saw thousands of tiny fires flickering along the dark coastlines. These were the campfires of the people who lived there, kept burning day and night to fight off the freezing dampness. By the time Charles arrived in December of 1832, the fires were still there. But the Beagle was carrying something very unusual in its cramped cabins. 3 very special passengers. You see, a few years earlier, on a previous voyage, Captain Fitzroy had taken 4 native people from Tierra del Fuego back to England. He wanted to civilize them. He dressed them in English clothes, taught them English manners, and even introduced them to the King and Queen. One of them sadly died. But the other 3, whom the sailors gave the nicknames York Minster, Fugia Basket, and a young boy called Jemmy Button, were now on the ship with Charles. Charles had spent months talking to Jemmy Button on the ship. Jemmy was a favorite of everyone. He wore polished boots, used a fork and knife, and spoke English with a polite accent. He loved his new life. But as the Beagle approached the jagged, snowy peaks of his homeland, Charles watched Jemmy closely. He wondered, what happens to a person when you pluck them from one world and drop them into another? And more importantly, what happens when you try to send them back? The weather at the Horn, the tip of South America, was terrifying. Charles wrote that the waves were like mountains of moving water. The ship would climb up a massive wall of grey sea, pause for a terrifying second at the top, and then slide down into a dark valley of foam. Everything on the ship was wet. The blankets were damp, the food was salty, and the wind was so cold it felt like needles on the skin. Charles, of course, was back to his old habit of being terribly seasick, but even through his misery, he couldn't stop looking at the landscape. Tierra del Fuego was a place of terrible grandeur. He saw glaciers, massive rivers of ice that flowed right down from the mountains and crashed into the sea with a sound like thunder. He saw forests of stunted, wind-bent trees covered in thick moss. It felt like a world that was still being born, or perhaps a world that was slowly dying. When they finally dropped anchor in a quiet cove to return Jemmy and the others to their families, Charles had the shock of his life. A group of local native people, the Yagan, came out to meet them. They were almost entirely naked in the freezing sleet, their skin covered in grease to keep out the cold. They let out wild, rhythmic cries that echoed off the cliffs. Charles sat in the small rowing boat, looking from the wild people on the shore to his friend Jemmy Button, sitting next to him in his fancy English suit. He was stunned. He realized that these people, who lived such different lives, were essentially the same. He wrote in his journal that the difference between a civilized man and a savage was greater than the difference between a wild animal and a pet. But he also saw that they were all one human family. It made him realize that humans, just like the beetles and the giant sloths, were shaped by their environment. If you live in a world of ice and stone, you become a person of ice and stone. The Beagle crew built a small house for Jemmy, gave him tools, seeds and clothes, and left him there with his people. When they returned months later to check on him, they almost didn't recognize him. The polished boots were gone. The suit was gone. Jemmy was thin. His hair was long and matted, and he was living just like his ancestors. But when he saw the ship, he paddled out to say hello. He told them he was happy. He didn't want the English life anymore. He wanted his home. Charles realized then that progress wasn't a straight line. Life finds a way to be exactly what it needs to be in the place where it lives. But the Earth itself had one more lesson for Charles in South America, and this one was loud. In early 1835, while the ship was further north in Chile, Charles was lying down in a forest for a nap when the ground began to move. At first, it was a gentle tremble, but then it turned into a violent, sickening heave. The trees whipped around like blades of grass. It was a massive earthquake. He ran to the nearest town, Conception, and found it in ruins. Houses had fallen like decks of cards. But as a scientist, Charles noticed something even more incredible. He went down to the coast and saw that the land had literally been pushed up. Rocks that were underwater just a few minutes before, covered in fresh sea creatures and seaweed, were now high and dry, sitting several feet above the water. This was the final piece of the geological puzzle for Charles. He remembered the shells he found high up in the cliffs of Cape Verde. He remembered the books of Charles Lyell that said the earth changes slowly. Now, he had seen it with his own eyes. He realized that the Andes Mountains weren't just there. They were being built, inch by inch, earthquake by earthquake, over millions of years. Imagine the excitement in his mind. If the earth was constantly moving, rising and falling, then the animals living on that earth had to change too. If a mountain rose up and divided a forest into two halves, the animals on one side would be separated from the animals on the other. Over time, they would have to adapt to their new homes. They would evolve. Charles Darwin was no longer just a collector of curiosities. He was beginning to see the machinery of the world. He saw that everything was connected. The movement of the stars, the shaking of the ground, the fossils in the mud, and the way a young boy named Jemmy Button could change his life twice. The Beagle was finally leaving the coast of South America, turning its back on the mountains and the ice. They were heading out into the vast, empty blue of the Pacific Ocean. Their next stop was a tiny, lonely group of volcanic islands that most people in England had never even heard of. They were called the Galapagos. Charles thought it would just be another place to collect a few more birds and maybe some lizards. He had no idea that on those dusty black rocks he would find the key that would finally unlock the secret of life itself. But for now, the wind was at their back. Charles sat on the deck, his skin tanned by the sun and toughened by the salt, thinking about the naked people in the snow and the seashells on the mountain tops. He was a different man than the boy who had popped a beetle in his mouth all those years ago. He was a man who was learning to listen to what the earth was trying to tell him. And the earth was saying that nothing stays the same forever. As the stars of the southern hemisphere began to twinkle over the dark water, Charles closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic creak of the ship. The land of fire was behind him, but a fire of a different kind, a fire of an idea, was just starting to burn in his mind. And in our next chapter, that fire is going to grow into a light that will change the world forever. The HMS Beagle had been at sea for nearly 4 years. The wild, snowy peaks of Tierra del Fuego were now thousands of miles behind them, and the great blue desert of the Pacific Ocean stretched out in every direction. For weeks, the crew saw nothing but the horizon, a thin line where the deep indigo of the water met the pale turquoise of the sky. But in September of 1835, a new shape appeared on that horizon. It wasn't the lush green paradise of the movies. It was something much stranger. We have reached the sixth part of our journey, and this is the chapter that many people consider the most important of all. It is the story of a small, lonely group of volcanic rocks called the Galapagos Islands. To Charles, at first glance, they look like a version of hell. But within those black, jagged shores, he was about to find the keys to the kingdom of life. Now imagine Charles standing on the deck as the ship approached Chatham Island. The sun was incredibly hot, and the air smelled of sulfur and baked earth. Instead of white sandy beaches, the islands were made of black, twisted lava that looked like a frozen, stormy sea. There were no palm trees here, only ugly, greyish-white bushes and giant prickly pear cacti that looked like something out of a dream. Charles stepped onto the shore and felt the heat radiating through his boots. He looked around and saw the strangest creatures he had ever encountered. Crawling over the black rocks were hundreds of large, prehistoric-looking lizards. They were a dull, muddy black, with spikes on their backs and long, sharp claws. Charles, with his dry sense of humor, called them the imps of darkness. These were marine iguanas. Now, Charles was a curious man, and he wanted to know more about these imps. He noticed that unlike any other lizard in the world, these ones swam in the ocean to eat seaweed. He decided to do a little experiment, and this is one of those moments where we see the human side of Darwin. He picked up one of the lizards and threw it into a deep pool of water. He expected it to swim away. Instead, the lizard swam right back to him. He threw it in again, and again. It came back to the exact same spot. Charles realized that even though the lizard could swim, it was terrified of the sharks in the water. It felt safer on the hot, black rocks with the strange man throwing it around than it did in the deep blue sea. This taught Charles a big lesson. Animals have instincts that are built for their specific home. The iguana was black, so it could hide on the lava and soak up the sun. And it had claws, so it could grip the rocks while the waves crashed over it. It was designed by its environment, but the lizards were just the beginning. As the beagle moved from island to island, Charles headed up into the higher, wetter parts of the land. There, the air was cooler, and the grass was green. And there, he met the true kings of the islands, the giant tortoises. My friends, these weren't just big turtles, these were monsters. Some of them were so large that it took 6 men to lift them. They were so heavy that as they walked, they created wide beaten paths through the forest that looked like paved roads. Charles loved them. He actually tried to ride on their backs. He would jump on, give a little tap on the shell, and the tortoise would rise up and start walking. He said it was a very unsteady ride, and he found it very hard to keep his balance, but he couldn't help himself. He was like a child in a giant, prehistoric zoo. He noticed that the tortoises were very quiet, except for a deep, ghostly hissing sound they made when they drew their heads back into their shells. He watched them for hours, noticing how they traveled miles just to find a drink of water. But then he had a conversation that would change his life forever. He was having dinner with the vice governor of the islands, a man named Mr. Lawson. As they sat together, Mr. Lawson pointed to the giant tortoises and said something very casual, almost like he was talking about the weather. He said, "You know, I can look at any tortoise on these islands and tell you exactly which island it came from just by looking at the shape of its shell. Charles stopped eating. His fork probably stayed in mid-air. "What did you say?" he asked. Mr. Lawson explained that on the islands where it was very dry and the food was high up on the bushes, the tortoises had shells that curved up like a saddle, so they could stretch their long necks high into the air. But on the islands where it was wet and the grass was on the ground, the tortoises had round, dome-shaped shells because they didn't need to reach up. This was a massive aha moment. Charles realized that even though the islands were only a few miles apart, the animals on them were different. They were specialized. If God had created everything all at once, why wouldn't he just make one perfect tortoise for all the islands? Why make a different one for every little rock in the ocean? Then there were the birds. Charles spent a lot of time catching small brownish birds that we now call Darwin's finches. To be honest, at the time, Charles thought they were a bit boring. He didn't even keep very good notes on which island each bird came from, a mistake he would regret later. But he did notice something strange. Some had big, thick beaks for crushing seeds. Others had tiny, sharp beaks for eating insects. And yet, they all looked like they belonged to the same family. He also looked at the mockingbirds. He noticed that the mockingbirds on one island were slightly different from the ones on the next island. He started to think back to those rhea birds he saw in Patagonia. A pattern was emerging in his mind. It was like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and the pieces were finally starting to click together. He began to wonder, is it possible that a long, long time ago, a few birds and a few tortoises were blown out to these islands by a storm? And then, over thousands of years, as they lived on different islands with different food, they slowly changed? Did the environment act like a giant pair of scissors, trimming away the animals that didn't fit and keeping the ones that did? The Galapagos Islands were a little world within itself. Because they were so far from the mainland, Charles could see the machinery of life much more clearly. In the crowded forests of Brazil, there was too much going on. But here, on these lonely volcanic rocks, the story was simple. It was a story of survival. It was a story of change. As the Beagle prepared to leave the Galapagos and head across the rest of the Pacific toward Tahiti and Australia, Charles sat in his cabin, surrounded by jars of preserved finches and boxes of tortoise shells. He felt a sense of excitement that was almost overwhelming. He wrote in his notebook that the facts he found on these islands seemed to undermine the stability of species. That is a very fancy way of saying, I think everything we know about how life works might be wrong. He was beginning to see the tree of life. He saw that all these different tortoises and birds were like branches on a single tree. They all came from the same trunk, but they grew in different directions to find the light. It was a beautiful, simple, and yet terrifying idea. If it was true, it meant that humans were part of that tree too. It meant that we weren't separate from nature. We were right in the middle of it. But Charles wasn't ready to tell the world yet. He was still a gentleman scientist, and he knew that this idea would be like dropping a bomb on a Sunday morning church service. He needed more proof. He needed to go home. As the islands faded into the mist, Charles watched the last of the imps of darkness disappear from view. He was tired. He had been away from home for nearly 5 years. He missed his family so much it hurt. But he was also a man who had seen the secret of the world. He was no longer the boy who collected beetles for fun. He was the man who was going to tell the story of where we all came from. The ship was now turning toward the setting sun, heading for the white sands of Tahiti. The voyage was coming to an end, but for Charles Darwin, the real work, the work that would take him the next 20 years, was just about to begin. He had the seeds of the theory in his pocket, and now he just had to find a way to make them grow without burning the world down. So, let's leave the Beagle as it sails across the calm, moonlit waters of the Pacific. The giant tortoises are still hissing on their islands, and the finches are still cracking their seeds. But the world is never going to be the same again. Because Charles Darwin was there, and he was watching. The black, volcanic peaks of the Galapagos were finally sinking below the horizon, and for the first time in nearly 4 years, the HMS Beagle was truly pointing its nose toward home. But home was still a very, very long way away. We have reached the 7th part of our story, a chapter about the long, weary journey across the rest of the world, and the moment a young man realizes that his life is about to change forever. This is the story of the homebound heart, and the mystery of the platypus. Now imagine Charles Darwin sitting on the deck as the ship sailed through the warm tropical waters of the Pacific. To most of the sailors, this was the best part of the trip. The weather was beautiful, the winds were steady, and they were heading toward places that looked like the postcards you see in travel magazines. Their first stop after the Galapagos was Tahiti, and my friends, it was every bit the paradise you would imagine. Charles was enchanted. After the hot, sulphurous rocks of the Galapagos, Tahiti felt like a cool drink of water. He saw lush green mountains that touched the clouds, crystal clear lagoons filled with bright fish, and people who greeted him with genuine kindness and smiles. He spent his days hiking up to the waterfalls, eating tropical fruits he couldn't even name, and watching the sun set over the palm trees. He wrote in his journal that if there was a heaven on earth, he had found it. But even in paradise, Charles's mind was working. He started looking at the coral reefs that surrounded the islands. People at the time wondered how these massive walls of coral were built in the middle of the deep ocean. Charles had a theory, another one of his big ideas. He realized that as the volcanic islands slowly sank back into the ocean over millions of years, the coral kept growing upward toward the light. It was a beautiful, slow dance between the sinking land and the rising life. Even on vacation, our friend Charlie couldn't stop being a scientist, but the real weirdness was waiting for him in Australia. When the Beagle reached the shores of New South Wales in January of 1836, Charles stepped onto a continent that seemed to have been made by a completely different creator. He went for a walk in the woods near Sydney and saw animals that defied everything he knew about biology. He saw kangaroos hopping through the brush, carrying their babies in pouches. He saw colourful parrots that screamed like rusty hinges. But the thing that really broke his brain was the platypus. Imagine poor Charles sitting by the bank of a river, watching a platypus swim by. He saw a creature with the bill of a duck, the tail of a beaver, the fur of an otter, and, as he would later find out, it even laid eggs like a bird. He sat there on the grass, scratching his head. He wrote in his notebook, almost jokingly, that an unbeliever might look at Australia and think that 2 different creators had been at work, one for the rest of the world and one for this strange upside-down land. But then he started to think more deeply. He saw a little creature called a potoroo, which is a tiny marsupial that acts just like a rabbit back in England. He realized that even though the animals were completely different families, they were doing the same jobs in nature. It was another clue. It suggested that nature finds the same solutions to the same problems, no matter where you are. The puzzle pieces were piling up so high in his mind that he could hardly think of anything else. By this point, however, a new feeling was starting to take over: homesickness. It had been 4.5 years. 4.5 years of sleeping in a hammock. 4.5 years of eating salted meat and hard crackers. 4.5 years of missing his sister's letters and his father's garden. Charles was exhausted. He was tired of the sea, he wrote. He wanted a green field in England. He wanted a fire in a hearth. He wanted a conversation that didn't involve the price of rum or the direction of the wind. The ship sailed on, crossing the vast Indian Ocean. They stopped at the Cocos Islands, where Charles studied more coral, and then they rounded the tip of South Africa. In Cape Town, Charles had a very important meeting. He met Sir John Herschel, one of the most famous scientists in the world. They sat together and talked about what Herschel called the mystery of mysteries, the question of how new species of animals are born. Charles didn't tell him his secret theory yet. He wasn't ready. But hearing a great man like Herschel ask the same questions made Charles feel like he wasn't crazy. He wasn't just a boy collecting beetles. He was a soldier in a great intellectual war. As the Beagle crossed the Atlantic for the very last time, heading north toward England, Charles began to take stock of what he was bringing home. It was an incredible treasure chest of knowledge. He had over 5,000 dried specimens. He had nearly 2,000 pages of notes on geology and biology. He had jars filled with strange fish, boxes of colorful birds, and of course, those massive fossil bones from Patagonia. He also had a secret. He had sent some of his findings back to his mentor, Professor Henslow, during the trip. He didn't know it yet, but back in England, scientists were already talking about the young Mr. Darwin and his amazing discoveries. He was becoming famous before he even stepped off the boat. The final weeks of the journey were a test of patience. The ship was slow, and the weather was unpredictable. Charles would sit on the deck for hours, staring toward the north, trying to imagine the smell of English rain on English grass. He wrote to his sisters, "I abhor the sea and all ships which sail on it." He was done with the adventure. He was ready for the work. Finally, on a stormy, rainy night in October 1836, the HMS Beagle quietly slipped into the harbour at Falmouth, England. There were no crowds waiting for them. There were no brass bands. It was just a small, battered ship returning from a very long walk around the park. Charles didn't even wait for the morning. He grabbed his bags, hopped off the ship, and caught the first mail coach heading home. He travelled through the night, the wheels of the carriage splashing through the mud of the English countryside. He arrived at his father's house in Shrewsbury late at night. He didn't want to wake anyone up, so he stayed at a nearby inn and walked into the house the next morning while the family was having breakfast. Can you imagine that moment? His sisters screamed with joy. His father, the big, imposing doctor, looked at him and said, "Why, the shape of his head is quite altered." He meant it as a compliment. Charles looked older, stronger, and more confident. He wasn't the disgrace who had failed at medicine anymore. He was an explorer. He was a hero. But as Charles sat in his favorite chair, eating a real English breakfast and listening to the familiar sounds of the house, he felt a strange weight in his pocket. It was his small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were the observations of the tortoises, the finches, the giant fossils, and the naked people in the snow. He was home, but the world he had returned to was about to be turned upside down. He knew something that no one else in that room knew. He knew that the stability of species was a myth. He knew that life was a river, always moving, always changing. He had survived the storms of Cape Horn, the earthquakes of Chile, and the imps of darkness in the Galapagos. But now, he had to survive something much more difficult. Telling the truth to a world that wasn't sure it wanted to hear it. As the rain tapped gently against the windows of the Darwin house, Charles felt a sense of peace. The voyage was over. The HMS Beagle would soon be sold and forgotten. But the journey of the mind, the journey that would lead to a book that would shake the foundations of human thought, was only just beginning. Charles took a deep breath, looked out at his father's garden, and smiled. He was home, and he had a lot of work to do. He needed to sort his birds, he needed to study his bones, and most importantly, he needed to find the mechanism, the how and the why of life itself. Charles was finally home. After 5 years of sleeping in a swaying hammock and eating salt-cracked biscuits, the solid floors of his father's house in Shrewsbury felt almost strange beneath his feet. He was no longer the beetle boy who had left in a hurry. He was a man who had seen the world from its highest icy peaks to its darkest volcanic shores. But as the initial excitement of homecoming began to settle, a different kind of storm began to brew inside his mind. We have reached the 8th part of our story. This is a quieter chapter, set not on the high seas, but in the foggy streets of London and the study of a quiet country house. It's a story of secret notebooks, a very important wedding, and the moment a single sentence changed everything. When Charles arrived back in London to begin sorting through the thousands of specimens he had shipped home, he found that he was already a bit of a celebrity. The letters and fossils he had sent to Professor Henslow had been shared with the greatest scientific minds in England. Everyone wanted to meet the man from the Beagle. But as Charles began to hand over his treasures to the experts, something incredible happened. He gave his collection of Galapagos birds to a famous bird expert named John Gould. Charles had thought they were a mixture of different types of birds, some blackbirds, some wrens, some finches. But a few days later, Gould came back to him with a look of total shock on his face. "Mr. Darwin," he said, "these aren't different kinds of birds. They are all finches, every single one of them." Charles was stunned. He realized that on those tiny islands, one single family of birds had changed into a dozen different shapes to survive. Some had developed beaks like heavy nutcrackers, others like delicate tweezers. It was the same with the tortoises and the mockingbirds. The evidence was staring him in the face. Species were not fixed. They weren't created in one shape and left that way forever. They changed. They shifted. They evolved. In the summer of 1837, just a few months after his return, Charles opened a new leather notebook. On the first page, he wrote 2 words that would become the most famous in the history of science: "I think." Below those words, he drew a simple sketch. It wasn't a ladder, like people usually use to describe life. It was a tree. He saw that all of life was connected. An ancient trunk of a tree had branched out over millions of years. One branch led to the birds, another to the fish, another to the giant sloths, and yes, one branch led to us. It was a beautiful, dizzying vision of the world. It meant that we aren't separate from the rest of nature. We are cousins to the trees and brothers to the beetles. But Charles was a very careful man. He knew that this idea was scientific heresy. In the 1830s, most people believed that God had created every animal exactly as it was today. To suggest otherwise was to go against the church, against society, and even against his own family. He felt as if he were carrying a golden treasure that was also a ticking bomb. He told a friend later that confessing his theory felt like confessing a murder. Because of the stress and the years of travel, Charles's health began to fail. He suffered from mysterious stomach pains and headaches that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He needed peace. He needed a partner. And so, he did what any scientific mind would do. He made a list. He took a piece of paper and drew a line down the middle. On one side, he wrote, "Marry," and on the other, "Not marry." Under the marry side, he wrote things like children, constant companion, and better than a dog anyhow. Under not marry, he wrote loss of time, less money for books, and terrible loss of freedom. In the end, the Mary side won, and the person he chose was his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. Emma was brilliant, kind, and a wonderful piano player, but there was one big difference between them. Emma was a deeply religious woman. She believed in the traditional stories of the Bible with all her heart. When Charles finally told her a little bit about his dangerous ideas, it worried her. She wasn't angry, but she was scared that if Charles didn't believe in the same things she did, they wouldn't be together in the afterlife. It was a quiet, loving tension that would stay with them for their entire marriage. Out of respect for Emma, and out of fear of the public's reaction, Charles decided to keep his theory a secret. He and Emma moved out of the noisy, smoky air of London to a quiet house in the country called Down House. It was a beautiful place with a big garden and a sandwalk, a path where Charles would walk several times a day, thinking and thinking. To his neighbours, he just looked like a sickly, kind old gentleman who was obsessed with his garden. They had no idea that the man walking past their hedges was rewriting the history of the world. For the next 20 years, yes, 20 years, Charles Darwin worked in secret. He didn't just want to say that animals changed. He wanted to know how. He became obsessed with the small details. He spent 8 years, 8 whole years, studying barnacles. He looked at them under his microscope until his eyes hurt. He wanted to understand how even the tiniest creature changed over time. He started writing letters to farmers, pigeon breeders, and gardeners. He asked them, "How do you make a faster horse?" Or, "How do you get a bigger cabbage?" They all told him the same thing. You pick the best ones and let them breed. That was it. That was the mechanism. Charles called it natural selection. He realized that in nature, the environment does the picking. If a bird is born with a slightly stronger beak, and it helps him eat tough seeds that other birds can't eat, the bird will survive. He will have babies, and those babies will have that same strong beak. Over thousands of years, the best traits win out, and the species changes. It was so simple, and yet so powerful. It explained the tortoises of the Galapagos, the fossils of Patagonia, and the strange animals of Australia. It was the law of the jungle, written in the language of science. But still, Charles waited. He wrote a long essay about his theory, and told Emma that if he died, she should publish it. But as long as he was alive, he kept it locked in his desk. He was a perfectionist. He wanted more proof. He studied bees, he studied orchids, and he even studied how earthworms move the soil in his garden. He was building a wall of evidence so thick that no one could knock it down. But while Charles was working quietly in his study, the world was moving on. Other people were starting to ask the same questions. In the next part of our story, we will see what happens when a letter arrives in the mail that threatens to take away everything Charles had worked for. It was a moment of panic, a moment of honor, and the final push that forced the quiet man of Down House to finally speak his truth to the world. For now, let's leave Charles in his garden at Down House. The sun is setting over the English fields, and the only sound is the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. He is a man with a secret that is growing too big for his desk. He is a man who loves his wife, loves his children, and loves the truth, even when the truth is terrifying. The Beetle Boy has found the answer. Now, he just has to find the courage to say it out loud. And that, my friends, is where the real drama begins. For 20 long years, Charles Darwin lived a double life. To the villagers in the quiet town of Down, he was the kind, sickly gentleman who lived in the big house with the beautiful gardens. They saw him on his daily walks, a tall man with a growing white beard, poking at plants with his walking stick or staring intensely at a patch of weeds. They knew him as a father who played with his children and a neighbor who was always polite, if a bit shy. They had no idea that inside his study, behind a closed door, he was sitting on a secret that would fundamentally change how human beings understood their existence. We have reached the 9th part of our story, a chapter filled with tension, a race against time, and the heavy weight of a conscience. This is the story of the letter that changed everything and the birth of a book that shook the world. By the late 1850s, Charles had filled thousands of pages with evidence. He had studied the way pigeons were bred in London, the way seeds could float across the ocean and still grow, and the way the bones of a bat's wing looked remarkably like the bones of a human hand. He was finally, slowly, putting the finishing touches on a massive book he planned to call Natural Selection. He thought he had all the time in the world. He was a perfectionist, and he wanted his wall of evidence to be so high and so thick that no one could ever knock it down. But fate has a way of interrupting even the most careful plans. On a warm morning in June 1858, the postman delivered a letter to Down House that made Charles's heart nearly stop. The letter had traveled thousands of miles across the ocean from a small island in Indonesia. It was from a young, energetic naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Charles knew of Wallace. They had exchanged a few letters before. Wallace was a man much like the young Darwin had been, brave, curious, and currently traveling through the jungles of the Malay archipelago, catching butterflies and birds. But as Charles read Wallace's letter, he felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Wallace had been lying in a hammock, shivering with a terrible fever, when a sudden flash of insight hit him. He had come up with the exact same theory as Charles. In a short, brilliant essay, Wallace described natural selection almost perfectly. He hadn't spent 20 years thinking about it. He had figured it out in a single afternoon of tropical delirium. He sent it to Darwin, asking for his opinion, not knowing that Darwin had been working on the same thing since before Wallace was even a professional scientist. Charles was devastated. He was a man of great honor, and he felt trapped. If he published his work now, it would look like he had stolen the idea from the young man in the jungle. But if he stayed silent, 20 years of his life's work would be forgotten, and Wallace would get all the credit for an idea that Charles had discovered first. He wrote to his friend, the geologist Charles Lyell, "All my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." It was a dark time at Down House. To make matters worse, a terrible wave of scarlet fever hit the village. Charles's youngest son became very ill and, tragically, passed away. In the midst of his grief and his professional panic, Charles didn't know what to do. He told his friends he would rather burn his books than act unfairly toward Wallace. But his friends, Lyell and the botanist Joseph Hooker, wouldn't let that happen. They came up with a gentleman's solution. They decided to present both Wallace's essay and a short summary of Darwin's work at a meeting of the Linnean Society in London. That way, both men would get credit for the discovery. Interestingly, neither Darwin nor Wallace was actually there. Charles was at home mourning his son, and Wallace was still thousands of miles away, chasing butterflies, completely unaware that his letter had caused a scientific earthquake in England. The presentation happened on July 1st, 1858. Strangely, the people in the audience didn't quite realize the importance of what they were hearing. The president of the society even said later that nothing especially interesting had happened that year. They couldn't have been more wrong. The gentleman's agreement gave Charles the push he finally needed. He realized he couldn't spend another 10 years writing his big book. He had to act. He put aside his massive manuscript and started writing what he called an abstract, a shorter, faster version of his theory. For 13 months, he worked like a man possessed. His health was terrible. He suffered from constant nausea and dizzy spells, but he kept writing. He was no longer just a scientist. He was a storyteller, trying to explain the history of life in a way that people could actually understand. Finally, in November 1859, the book was ready. It had a very long title, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It was a thick, green book, and Charles was terrified of how the world would react. He sent copies to the great thinkers of the day with nervous little notes, almost apologizing for what he had written. The day the book was released, something happened that shocked the publishers. All 1,250 copies sold out on the very first day. It was the 19th century version of a viral sensation. Everyone was talking about it. In the universities, in the churches, and over dinner tables across the country. The book was like a lightning bolt. It was beautifully written, easy to understand, and filled with so many facts that it was hard to argue with. Charles showed how everything in nature, from the way a bee builds its honeycomb to the way a flower attracts a moth, was part of a great ongoing struggle for survival. He didn't use the word evolution until the very end, and he barely mentioned humans at all. He knew that the idea of humans coming from animal ancestors was the most sensitive part, so he only left one tiny hint at the very end of the book. He wrote, "Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." That one little sentence was enough to set the world on fire. The reaction was explosive. Some people called Charles the most brilliant man alive. Others called him a dangerous man who wanted to destroy religion and morality. Famous cartoons began to appear in the newspapers showing Charles's head on the body of a monkey. People were shocked by the idea that they weren't specially created, but were instead related to the creatures of the forest. Because of his poor health, Charles didn't go out and fight the battles himself. He stayed at Down House, tucked away in his study, while his friends, especially a brilliant, fiery man named Thomas Henry Huxley, went out and debated the critics. Huxley became known as Darwin's bulldog because he defended the theory with such ferocity. One of the most famous moments in the history of science happened a few months later at a big meeting in Oxford. A bishop named Samuel Wilberforce stood up and mockingly asked Huxley if it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed his descent from a monkey. Huxley didn't blink. He stood up and said he would rather be related to a humble monkey than to a man who used his great intellect to obscure the truth. The room went wild. The Battle of the Monkeys was on, and the world was beginning to realize that Charles Darwin's idea wasn't just a fancy guess. It was the truth. Back at home, Charles watched all of this through the letters he received every day. He was happy the theory was winning, but he was also a bit sad. He knew that his book had caused Emma, his beloved wife, a lot of pain. She stood by him, as she always did, nursing him through his illnesses and reading his proofs. But she still worried about his soul. Charles loved her for that. Their marriage was a beautiful example of how two people can disagree on the biggest questions in the world and still love each other deeply. As the first edition of the book disappeared from the shelves in a second, then a third edition was printed. Charles felt a strange sense of relief. The secret was out. He was no longer confessing a murder. He was the man who had given humanity a new story. A story of a world that wasn't static and dead, but a world that was constantly growing, changing, and striving. He looked out his window at the entangled bank of his garden. He saw the birds singing, the insects flitting among the flowers, and the worms turning the soil. He saw it all differently now. It wasn't just a garden. It was a battlefield and a cathedral at the same time. He had found the grandeur in this view of life, and he had finally shared it with the world. But the story isn't quite over. In our final chapter, we will see how Charles lived out his final years, how he finally addressed the monkey question head-on, and how the boy who once held beetles in his mouth was laid to rest in the most honored place in England. For now, let's leave the world to argue over his book, while Charles Darwin takes a slow, quiet walk on his sandwalk, listening to the birds and knowing at last that he has done his work. The seeds were planted, the tree was growing, and nothing would ever be the same again. The world was now buzzing with the name of Charles Darwin. His book, On the Origin of Species, had done exactly what he had both feared and hoped it would. It had fundamentally changed the conversation of humanity forever. But while the newspapers were filled with mocking cartoons of him, and the great universities were locked in fierce, shouting debates over his ideas, the man himself remained a quiet, almost ghostly figure, tucked away in the shadows of Down House. He was not a man who enjoyed the spotlight. He was a man who enjoyed the truth, and he still had a few more deep truths left to tell before his time was done. We have reached the final part of our long journey together. This is a story of the twilight years of a giant, a chapter filled with the tenderness of a long marriage, the strange music of earthworms, the final answer to the monkey question, and the legacy of a man who started as a disgrace and ended as a hero of the human race. For about 10 years after his big book was published in 1859, Charles stayed somewhat silent on the most controversial topic of all, us. In his first book, he had been very careful. He only left one tiny hint at the very end, writing that light will be thrown on the origin of man. He knew that the world wasn't quite ready to hear that we, with our art and our music and our cathedrals, were cousins to the creatures of the forest. He watched from his study as the world wrestled with the idea. He saw people start to use his words to explain everything from business to war, often in ways that made him very uncomfortable and sad. But by the year 1871, he felt he could wait no longer. He was 62 years old. His health was still fragile, and his beard was now a long, snowy white drift that made him look like an ancient prophet. He felt it was time to finish the job he had started 40 years earlier on the deck of the Beagle. He sat down and wrote The Descent of Man. In this book, he didn't pull any punches. He didn't hide behind fancy words. He laid out the evidence that humans, like every other creature on the planet, had evolved from simpler forms. He talked about our similarities to the great apes, not just in the shape of our bones, but in the shape of our hearts and minds. Imagine Charles sitting in his study, looking at his old sketches from the London Zoo. He wrote about the way a mother monkey loves her child with a fierce, protective gaze, just as a human mother does. He wrote about the way a dog feels shame or a sense of naughtiness when it has done something wrong. He argued that our moral sense, our ability to know right from wrong, and our desire to help others, wasn't a magical gift dropped from the sky. Instead, it was a survival tool. He believed that our ancestors survived because they learned to be kind to one another. Those who cooperated, those who protected the weak, and those who worked together were the ones who survived to pass on their genes. To Darwin, our kindness was just as evolutionary as a bird's wing or a tiger's tooth. Again, the world erupted. But this time, something was different. The shock was slowly turning into understanding. Even though many people still disagreed with him, the scientific world had largely moved to his side. He was no longer a rebel. He was the elder statesman of science. He received letters from all over the world, from young students in America to old professors in Germany. Everyone wanted to know what the wise man of Down House thought. But if you had visited Down House during these years, you wouldn't have seen a man who thought he was a legend. You would have seen a grandfather who was deeply loved by his 7 surviving children. He was a man who still got excited about the smallest, useless things. In his final years, he turned his attention back to the tiny details of his own garden. He became obsessed with plants that move. He wrote a book about climbing plants and how they sense a pole or a tree to wrap around. He spent months watching orchids, fascinated by the clever, almost intelligent ways they trick insects into carrying their pollen. And then there were the earthworms. This is my favorite part of the Darwin story, because it shows just how much he loved the small things. Charles spent years studying the humble worms in his garden. To most people, a worm is just a slimy thing you step on. But to Charles, they were the unseen architects of the world. He would sit for hours in the dark with a lantern, watching them pull leaves into their burrows. He wanted to know if they could hear or feel vibrations. In a scene that must have looked quite funny to his neighbors, he had his son, Frank, play the bassoon loudly right next to a jar of worms. He even had Emma play her grand piano for them. The worms didn't seem to care about the music, but when he placed the jar on top of the piano, they felt the vibrations and wiggled away. He realized that these tiny, ignored creatures were responsible for creating the very soil that allows all life on land to exist. They were turning the earth over and over, burying ancient ruins and keeping the planet fertile. It was the perfect Darwinian discovery. It showed that small, slow changes made by millions of tiny individuals over a vast amount of time can literally change the face of the earth. As the 1880s began, Charles's strength started to fade. He walked more slowly on his sandwalk path. He spent more time resting in his chair, listening to Emma play the piano in the next room. He remained a man of great kindness and humility. He never lost his sense of wonder, even when his body was failing him. He once told a friend, "I feel like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, while the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." He knew that he hadn't found all the answers, but he was happy to have found a few of the most important ones. In April 1882, Charles Darwin's heart finally began to fail for the last time. He was 73 years old. He was ready. His last words to his beloved Emma were a testament to the love that had sustained him through all the years of controversy and illness. He told her, "I'm not the least afraid of death. Remember what a good wife you have been to me. Tell all my children to remember how good they have been to me." He passed away quietly on April 19th, in the house where he had spent 40 years thinking the thoughts that changed history. The family's wish was to bury him in the local churchyard in Down, in the quiet, damp earth he had studied so well. They wanted him to be among the trees and the worms he loved. But the world had other plans. As soon as the news of his death reached London, a great wave of emotion swept through the country. A group of scientists and members of Parliament petitioned the government, insisting that a man of his importance deserved the highest honour England could give. And so, on a grey, rainy Wednesday, the boy who had once been called a disgrace for catching rats and collecting beetles was carried into Westminster Abbey. The funeral was one of the grandest events of the century. The streets of London were lined with people. Inside the Abbey, the air was heavy with the smell of incense and the sound of a grand choir. The pallbearers included his best friends, Hooker and Huxley, and even the grandson of his old captain from the Beagle, Robert Fitzroy. Charles Darwin was buried just a few feet away from the great Sir Isaac Newton. It was a moment of incredible irony. The man who had been accused of destroying religion was laid to rest with the highest honours of the Church of England. As the choir sang and the great bells of London tolled, the world said goodbye to the most revolutionary thinker of the age. But the story of Charles Darwin didn't end in the stone floor of a cathedral. It lives on every single day. It lives on every time a doctor develops a new medicine to fight a virus that is evolving. It lives on every time a scientist looks through a telescope at a distant planet and wonders if life might be growing there too. It lives on every time a child looks at a bird in the garden and wonders why its beak is shaped just so. Charles Darwin taught us that we are not alone in the universe. He taught us that we are part of a grand, ancient, and beautiful story that is still being written every second of every day. He showed us that there is grandeur in this view of life, and that we are all, from the tiniest worm to the greatest philosopher, connected in one single magnificent family. The HMS Beagle is long gone, its timbers rotted away. The giant tortoises of the Galapagos are still there, hissing in the sun and walking their ancient paths. The finches are still cracking their seeds, and we, the humans, who can finally see the tree we belong to, are still here, wandering, learning, and evolving, all through. And so, our long voyage with Charles Darwin finally comes to an end. We have travelled from the messy, beetle-filled pockets of a little boy in Shrewsbury to the silent honour halls of Westminster Abbey. We have seen the jungles of Brazil, the mountains of the Andes, and the strange volcanic secrets of the Galapagos. We have followed the path of a man who simply refused to stop asking why, even when the answers were scary. I truly hope you've enjoyed this journey through the chaos of delight that was his life. If this story has helped you relax, or perhaps sparked a bit of curiosity about the wonderful living world outside your own window, please consider taking a moment to like and subscribe to our podcast. It truly costs nothing, but it helps us more than you know to keep these histories alive and flowing to listeners all over the world. And for those of you who feel like going an extra mile to support our work and help us keep this channel independent, a small donation at ko-fi.com/history-to-relax means the world to us. It helps us spend the time needed to research and write these stories with the care they deserve. Take a moment tonight, before you drift off to sleep, to look at the world around you. Remember that everything you see, the birds in the trees, the flowers in the garden, and even the person in the mirror, is a leaf on that same magnificent tree of life that Charles saw all those years ago. We are all cousins, we are all connected, and we are all part of the greatest adventure ever told. Thank you so much for being here with me. Keep wondering, keep exploring, and most importantly, sleep well.